Hello, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to the human trafficking training in a clinical setting. My name is Richard Showborough. I'm with Hope for Justice, and with me today is Dr. Kelly Clunan, who will be assisting with today's training. Throughout the course of this training, we will discuss human trafficking, its issues overall, and then its issues within a hospital or clinician setting. There will be some available handouts that do accompany the training that we will provide at the end of this training during our Q&A session, and other resources that we have available for you. We host this training once a month at various times in order to reach a maximum audience with that. As I said before, I'm Richard Showborough. I've been with Hope for Justice for approximately 5 years. Prior to that, I was with the FBI and the CIA working international terrorism and human trafficking cases before now leading the U.S. Office for Hope for Justice. And Kelly, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Kelly Clunan. I have been a nurse educator for a little over 10 years. Prior to that, I was a pediatric nurse, and I am volunteering with Hope for Justice to do some training and get this information out to clinicians. We have some great reasons in here why we want to train you as clinicians, and we're really excited that you're here.
So thank you for joining us during this presentation. A little bit about Hope for Justice is, our mission is to end modern slavery by prevention, rescue, restore, and reforming society. This is one of our preventative measures by bringing education and awareness to the communities in the sectors that we know that have the opportunity to intersect with trafficking victims. And we know that the clinician setting is certainly one of them. We exist on approximately 5 continents now, over 40 offices. We have investigative teams that are retired law enforcement that work investigations and hand in hand with law enforcement to rescue victims. We also provide training to different sectors of the community, whether it is clinician, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's the financial sector, so we provide that training in specific to that. We also look to provide aftercare facilities and restoring lives, because we know that rescuing victims is just an event. It's a process itself to take them from the event of rescue through this traumatic and trauma-based care, and then reforming society. We advocate. We have an office in Washington, D.C., and then also in a lot of major cities where we advocate for changes in laws that impact trafficking and trafficking victims. So before we start, we kind of really want to define what human trafficking is. A lot of people have misconceptions as to what makes up human trafficking. And when Kelly and I originally developed this training for delivery to the Department of State, we chose to use the Department of State's definition of human trafficking. And it is the recruitment, harboring, or transportation, or basically obtaining a person for labor or services, those being sexual exploitation through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And when we talk about this, anytime, that through the use of force, fraud, or coercion, whether it's in a labor setting or a sexual setting, you don't have to meet all 3 elements for it to be human trafficking. And a lot of people say that he or she was addicted to narcotics, they were addicted to drugs. Often trafficking victims are. It's a means of control. So when we look at it from that aspect, we know that is it as well. Some of the facts that surround this, that make this kind of important for us to understand the impact of this. I'm going to try to mute that person who's on. I think I got him. Apologies for that. Some of the facts that surround human trafficking and make it so important for us to understand the gravity of the situation and why it's so important for us to understand how we can combat this. It's 25 million victims in this world. 25 million. We're in 2021. And we still have 25 million people who are victims of human trafficking. 5 million of those are being forced into sexual exploitation. Okay. And here's the key reason why. It is a $150 billion a year business. When we start talking about human trafficking and why it is the way it is, why is it the second fastest growing crime in the world? Well, it is the second fastest growing crime in the world because you can only sell that drug once, but you can sell that little girl, that little boy, that lady, that man over and over and over again. That is why we look at it from that aspect. So wherever you are right now in the United States, this just kind of gives you a snapshot as to the trafficking problem across the U.S. These are based on statistics gathered from Polaris, which is a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. that actually collects statistics on ongoing cases. And as you can see where each state ranks in particularly the region that they're in. And some of the facts that we want to kind of still hammer home here for you, 76% of our trafficking victims are female. And roughly about 20% of that demographic is underage. And when we mean underage, we're looking at most of the typical teenage victims for a girl's age is between 12 and 14 years of age. And for a boy, it's a little bit earlier, 11 to 13. So we're talking 12 to 14. 1.6, and we know this is an extremely vulnerable community, the runaway community. 1.6 to 2 million runaways are in the US right now. Okay, over 50% of them are female. And we know that 1 in 3 of those runaways, 1 in 3 is likely a trafficking victim. And they say, why is that the case? Because we know that runaways have to resort to what we refer to as survival sex. They're on the street, they have no money, they have no clothing. Most of them don't have any way to communicate, and they're looking for shelter. They're looking for as a way that they can feel safe at night. So they resort to survival sex for a safe place to stay, for food to eat. And then a trafficker uses that as a means of grooming and manipulation and control. And then 1, 2, 3, they're in the trafficking cycle.
So why are you guys here today? This right here is a big reason. If you look at this number, a recent study showed that 87.8% of human trafficking survivors had been in contact with a healthcare provider in some capacity during their victimization. 87.8%. So basically almost 9 out of 10 have at some point while they were being victimized saw a healthcare provider. That is huge. And about 68% were from the emergency department. And one thing I want to point out is I just saw actually recently on Hope for Justice's website that from them receiving a training from Hope for Justice that a nurse, I believe it was a nurse, or was it just a healthcare provider, Rich? You have to remind me. I'm bad with those kind of facts. But they got this training and did identify a victim and were able to help rescue someone. Hope for Justice was able to be contacted and they were able to get that victim rescued. So again, that's why you're here. That's huge. So with COVID, you guys know the economic crisis. Richard just talked about, the vulnerable populations and different things. We kind of touched on that. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But that population has really increased because of the economic issues with COVID. And human trafficking cases are up 185%. 185%. 1 in 5 kids are sexually propositioned online, and there is a 90% increase in the number of reports of online enticement. And so this really is coming from live streaming, smartphones, things like TikTok, Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, all those. I mean, there's a million. The games as well, I want to mention that. So all the different games have really provided a massive hunting ground for traffickers. And so what they do is they cast a huge net out to who knows how many, girls and boys too, and send out, who knows the same message to each of them. And they only need a few people to say yes and to start a conversation to start that exploitation. So yeah, 1 in 5 kids. So I like to mention that here because most of you guys know a child or have a relative. And it's just something that we like to touch on in this training, even though it's focused on clinicians. But something for you to take home too. And here's a really important thing. So let's say you have a child or somebody who, is on their tablet. I mean, most kids have tablets or phones. That's that's realistic and what's happening right now. So how can you spot a sign for online grooming? So here's some really good key indicators to look at. If the child's being really secretive, maybe they've gotten some gifts that you don't know where they came from. They're kind of sketchy about who they're talking to. They're not giving a lot of information. Maybe they're super emotional, angry, or scared when they get a call on their phone, or when they need to go out of the room to do something, or if their phone rings or their tablet, or they just seem really kind of emotional. And this could go again, angry, scared, any of those. Distracted. So a lot of the time on the internet, this is a hard one to judge with COVID. Obviously, kids are spending a lot of time on there. Parents are working from home. Their kids are on their tablets or their phones. They're doing homeschool now sometimes or virtual school, I should say, or homeschool. But increasing amounts, if you're noticing that they keep wanting to go back to it, and maybe even doing it in privacy. So they're withdrawn from family and friends. They're maybe not wanting to play with their friends, not wanting to interact with the family, always wanting to be in their room with the door shut. If they're vague, not answering questions again about their boyfriend or girlfriend that they're talking about, just make sure you're looking into that, or sharing this information with those that that have younger kids, and younger. I mean, this could be high schoolers as well, so teenagers as well. So keep that in mind as you interact.
And before I move on to the next slide, I just wanted to comment, Kelly, on what you had brought up about the young lady that had been rescued. She was from the Midwest, and it was a nurse who had actually received this particular training, and through some of the tips and the red flag sheets that Kelly had provided, particularly the interviewing techniques that we will talk about in here as well, and establishing rapport. Through that she learned, she was able to develop a relationship or establish a rapport with this victim who was in the hospital, and who was put in the hospital from her trafficker. He had beaten her pretty bad that had put her in the hospital, and she finally admitted that she had been trafficked and needed help, and they had reached out to us, and we were able to get the victim into a safe place, and we were able to get them into an aftercare facility where it could care for her and provide her that trauma-based care, where otherwise this might have gone unrecognized and looked like a typical DV case, and not being recognized as a trafficking case.
Thank you for more info. Yeah, it's great. And just, I love that, because that's why you guys are here. We love that you're here today getting this training, so that you have some of those tips and tools, like Richard just said, that you know what to do when you do suspect something going on. So that's awesome.
Yeah, and we often look at how what human trafficking is and what human trafficking isn't, and the media really shapes how we look at human trafficking, and Hollywood really over sensationalizes it. People often think that human trafficking is the movie Taken, and does that happen? Sure. Is that the majority of what happens? No. It's such a small percentage. Abduction is such a minute percentage that we don't even talk about it that much, because it is so small as a percentage that happens that way. But this is how we think of human trafficking, and it kind of forms the way we do. And one of my friends is a prosecutor. She's a lead prosecutor for human trafficking in a large metropolitan city, and she says the hardest part for me is to convince a jury that this is human trafficking. Convict this man. He trafficked this girl. And the jury is always like, well, he didn't abduct her, and they have in their mindset that, like, if it isn't like Taken, then it wasn't human trafficking. But you have to keep in mind, it's force, fraud, and coercion. One of those three, regardless of the victim, whether the victim was addicted to drugs or not addicted to drugs, or forced into prostitution, or forced to use drugs, they're being controlled. And we'll talk about some of that in here. But the media kind of, misconceptualizes that. So when we talk about some of the common misconceptions, it's important for us to realize that, it's a crime that only involves foreigners. Not true at all. In fact, last year, more than 80% of the trafficking victims that identified in the U.S. were U.S. citizens. Now, is this a statistic that we will see change over a period of time? Absolutely, no doubt that what we're seeing right now in the southwest border, in the immigration, whether you believe in it or you don't believe in it, that's not an argument to have. We have a very vulnerable population that is at our borders right now that will change this figure because of the level of vulnerability to trafficking that they have. But currently, right now, we know it's U.S. citizens. It's not just foreigners. So you could really say that it affects, U.S. citizens and non-U.S. citizens equally, because traffickers don't care who you are. They look at your vulnerability. If you're exploitable, that's what they're looking for. They're not looking for a particular race or a particular gender or even a particular socioeconomic status. They're looking for vulnerability is what they look for. It requires foreign or interstate travel. Not true. You don't have to come across the border from Mexico or come into the United States from Europe. There are people who are trafficked on the same street they live on, they grew up on, they never even leave the state. Okay. It's only related to the sex industry. That's not true. We'll talk about that. It involves labor, it involves domestic servitude, forced marriage. We'll talk about the different types of trafficking. Victims self-identify. Often, sometimes victims will end up putting themselves in a position where they feel like they don't deserve any more than this in their life. This is what they're destined for. They feel like they put themselves in the situation because of their addiction or their lack of socioeconomic status, or this is what they've had to do. So they don't identify themselves as a victim of human trafficking. Okay. There's always an origin place. Not necessarily. Sometimes you'll hear people that are brought in to a sporting event like a Super Bowl or a large event like that to be sold to buyers. And when we look at that, a lot of people will often say these attract a lot of trafficking situations. Actually, they attract prostitution. Is what they attract. People get online and they search for prostitutes. Okay, the trafficker is supplying the demand of the trafficking victims, and that's what it is. And it's unfortunate when we look at things like that. Well, we also have to understand the differences between trafficking and smuggling, because there is a stark difference between the two. They're not the same. Okay, they're not the same. Mainly the key thing that we look at when we look at the differences between trafficking and smuggling is voluntary and involuntary. No one's ever raised their hand and said, hey, will you traffic me? But people do raise their hand and ask to be smuggled into another country. It happens all over the world because they're being pushed and pulled out of the area that they are in. And we'll talk a little bit about the vulnerabilities of push and pull factors. When we look at the trafficking and smuggling, both of these are operated through criminal networks. Both of them are very profitable. The stark distinction that you should know between them is one's voluntary and one's involuntary. Okay. But just because somebody is smuggled into the country, okay, when we look at trafficking and smuggling, doesn't necessarily mean if they're smuggled, they're not vulnerable to being trafficked. They're highly vulnerable in that situation to being trafficked, highly vulnerable. So you actually can be both. You can be smuggled in and then later trafficked from that. But why is this happening? When we look at what are some of what is feeding the trafficking funnel, each area that we live in has a different feeder to the funnel that feeds this human trafficking phenom. And when we look at human trafficking, each area is different. Each demographic is different. We know for a fact that runaways that leave an abusive or neglective home because they're not getting what they need in that home, or they're being sexually assaulted in that home, or they're being physically abused in that home, they'll run away. And then that makes them extremely vulnerable, okay, to trafficking. In case in point, we had worked an investigation, and it was just on the news this past week, where we were talking about a 14-year-old runaway who also happened to be a foster child. And she came from a home that was a good home. The parents were not abusive by any means whatsoever. They had taken in several foster kids, 10. She was the 11th that they had brought in, and they were good parents to these kids. They provided them with food and shelter, provided them with a home. The 14-year-old decided to run away because she had not yet formed a bond yet with her brothers and sisters, or stepbrothers and sisters. She was looking for attention, and she just wanted to get out of there. So she did. and she walked 27 miles or traveled 27 miles from her home before we were able to locate her. And when we had located her, she had already been trafficked in a matter of 2 days. When we got to her, she was sitting on a couch with just a t-shirt on, and that was it. And it was actually a woman who had trafficked her, which is not the norm, but it goes to show you that this is such a um, you know money making business that people everyone is involved in it to make money. So when we look at this, look at instability in the home. These are some of the push and pull factors. Instability in the community that they're from. When we talk about people that are coming in from the southwest border, think about they're leaving poverty stricken areas, and they're leaving violence, they're war torn, they're leaving gang influenced, they're leading areas in order to come here for a better life that makes them more vulnerable. Okay, we talk about online grooming. We have particularly earlier in the training session, Kelly talked about COVID and talked about how easy it was for these traffickers to groom people online. Offering them false promises is another thing that they look for online. Is they tell them, hey, you're beautiful, would can I take some pictures of you, you could be a model. You have these kids that are easily receptive to this type of attention, particularly at that younger age, and these traffickers groom them over a period of time. And we also talk about substance abuse. Those individuals who become addicted, and the traffickers typically look to addict their victims with a narcotic, particularly heroin or meth, so they can control them, a highly addictive substance, so they can use that as a means of control. So, indicators for the victim. And, earlier I had discussed that, traffickers, they don't necessarily look for anything in specific. They look for somebody who is vulnerable. That is what they look for. They do not particularly care about race. Sometimes they don't even care about age. Particularly, they prefer to have younger, easily manipulated people. Is what they look for. Somebody that can easily be groomed, easily manipulated. Okay, but there's no like exact mold, and that's what the difficulty is, and that's why raising awareness can lead to education, which then can lead to rescuing these individuals, because we need to identify who they are. They're not walking around with a t-shirt, unfortunately. It says, hey, I'm a trafficking victim. Can you help me? So we know that there are at-risk groups that are out there. And some of those groups we had already mentioned: your homeless, your runaways, your teenagers, and then the online during the COVID pandemic is, created a pattern of behavior for our younger population. It's not as if, when COVID started, we saw more and more as if this could actually happen, because I have a teenager, but more and more seeing them online. Yeah, could they spend more time online? Yeah, obviously they are. But now that we start seeing restrictions loosen up, as we start seeing some normalcy come back, we're not going to see people stop using technology. They're not going to say, well, things are back to normal, I don't need to be online near as much as I was before. They're still going to be online. We've created that pattern for that, to show that people will continually be on that line. Most of our victims that we look at are going to be women and girls. So when you hear us kind of use the term she or this girl or lady or teenage, or it's because most victims are females, and majority of those are young girls, 25%, and they're disproportionately affected by, the poverty, the lack of access to education, unemployment, particularly when we're looking at the times of COVID. We're looking at a higher level of economic opportunity availability for people, and this can provide them with a short-term economic opportunity. And we had talked about previously, it's not just related to the sex industry, where a lot of people have that misconception when we talk about human trafficking. They think to themselves, hey, this is just, sexual exploitation. That's what this is. But it's not just that. It's forced labor, sexual exploitation, forced marriage, domestic servitude, criminal activity, and unfortunately, organ harvesting. And when we talk about forced labor, when we look at these vulnerable population that are trying to immigrate into the U.S., and when they come in, they're going to be extremely susceptible or vulnerable to forced labor, particularly when we look at looking for jobs, looking for job opportunities. We're going to see an increase in that. We're going to see an increase in the sexual exploitation during that time. Forced marriage as well, and domestic servitude. One of the hardest identifying human trafficking scenarios is domestic servitude. I mean, a lot of these victims work in homes, and they work as nannies, or they work as house cleaners and things like that. And to identify them, we're just going to go knock on everybody's door and, oh, hey, you got somebody in here keeping as a domestic slave? No, you can't identify them like that. One of the victims that we rescued this past year was in California, and she was rescued through the help of a clinician, through a nurse. She had been brought to the United States 37 years ago to become a nanny for a family. The family kept her passports. She slept in the basement on a sheet on the hard floor. She only got to eat what was left over from dinner. And I'm not talking about what was left over. I mean, what was left over on the plates of the people that she provided service to. And she became ill, and they took her to the hospital. And this nurse had fortunately received this training and had separated her from her trafficker and interviewed her and called us. And we were able to work with the federal authorities to rescue her and bring the perpetrators to justice. But this lady was 78 years old, 78 years of age. She had been in domestic servitude for 37 years. She had been to a hospital setting before, it just gone unrecognized. There were several barriers that existed. One being that the trafficker never was away from her and spoke for her the entire time. Two, there was a language barrier. She was from the Philippines and didn't speak English. Fortunate for us, then the nurse actually was also from the Philippines, and she spoke her native language, so she was able to talk with her about this. But there's a lot of different avenues and skills that we can use that Kelly will talk about a little bit later that will help with this avenue. So when we talk about the industries that we're going to see sex trafficking in, particularly, we'll see sex trafficking, whether it's in prostitution, hotels and brothels. Massage parlors are one of the largest areas that we see sexual exploitation in now. And then advertisement on the internet. And people, I always tell them, it's hard to police the internet. Okay, it's extremely difficult. Law enforcement can't do it. You can't be everywhere all the time. It's impossible. And there are so many areas where these individuals are advertised for sex online, particularly when we look at Backpage. Backpage was a site much like Craigslist that advertised for sex based on the city and the area and what you were looking for. And it was shut down through federal task force. Backpage website was seized, and they were no longer able to advertise it. But keep in mind, remember I'm telling you, this is $150 billion a year business. So criminals don't go away that easy. So they just created a new, and it's called ebackpage.com. And now that's where they advertise for sexual services within there. So when we're talking about that, that's kind of one of the issues that we look at, is where these individuals being advertised at. And even things as common as Tinder. We know that people are being advertised on Tinder, and they're also being advertised on other sites that are out there. One of the other ones that we found out is called Rub Maps, which you can type in any city that you want, and it gives you a listing of massage parlors and the services that they provide at these massage parlors. And then additionally, other adult look sites that you look at. And a lot of these sites we learn about through interviews with trafficking victims. When we ask them, where were you trafficked? What hotels? Was it a brothel? Was it a massage parlor? Was it online? It was online. Where was it at online? Could you write down some of the websites so we can start tracking them and locate them? And, every time we talk to a victim, we receive a whole new list of websites, and it's almost impossible to keep up with these type of things because there are so many out there, so many avenues and opportunities for traffickers to do this. So, and when we look at, aside from sexual exploitation, we know that labor exploitation is a huge problem for us here in the United States. Whether we look at the migrant agricultural work, which we see is going to obviously increase with the influx that we're starting to see with the immigration, restaurant work, hotel, resort housekeeping, food processing, construction, and landscaping. One of the things that Kelly and I had talked about was how do we address these specific industries that we know are going to intersect with trafficking victims? And the key is to cater that training, not broad stroke it, and just provide a general awareness, but provide one that's a little bit more specific to that industry, particularly when we look at, when we talk about hotel and resort housekeeping and so forth. We worked very diligently this past year to pass a law in Iowa that requires now all hospitality industry workers to receive human trafficking awareness training. Otherwise, they get fined. All of their employees have to receive it, and they're not allowed also to have any business from the state or federal government. No one can stay at their hotel. So there's penalties for them not doing it. And I think this is a law that should be implemented across the country. Some states have it, some states don't. And I think that's what we need to see is industry specific training that looks at how we can best identify people, knowing those type of particular things that we look for. And, when we talk about labor trafficking, we know that the individuals are going to avoid eye contact. They're fearful, controlled by their employees. They typically don't have possession of their own documents, whether it's passport identification. And they're often travel to and from work in the same vehicle along with a lot of other people. They don't arrive with their own vehicle. They're not free to come and go as they please. They're very malnourished, untreated illnesses. They have a lack of personal hygiene, commonly wearing the same clothes every day. But may or may not speak English. And when I was talking with one of the victims at one time, and I asked him, I says, why don't you? Because when we look at variables, we look at red flags. These aren't things that we just pop up. I didn't Google them and find them. These are ones that we get from actual victims when we talk to them. And I'm like, what's your fear of looking at people? And he said, I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed of the where I am. I'm ashamed of what's happened to me. I'm ashamed that I keep letting it happen to me. And I'm just so ashamed of who I've become. I can't look anybody in the eye. I always look down. I look away. And I'm like, And some of these things is hard to understand until you've actually talked to a victim who will tell you why these are some of the things that actually happen to them, and why they actually feel this way or act this way, or why this shows them.
The one thing that's really challenging is identifying these victims, right? They don't necessarily self-identify. Sometimes that may happen, but it's not very likely. And really, it's because of the clandestine nature of this crime. The victims are socially isolated, they're underground. You just don't always see them. You don't understand. It's not necessarily at a brothel. It could be that they're being moved around to different locations. And, the internet obviously provides a great way for them to do it undetected in some ways. And, awareness and recognition of the populations that are most vulnerable. So what Richard just talked about, that's really a big part of this. Understanding that vulnerability plays a key part, and paying attention when you're with a vulnerable person, and understanding, those vulnerabilities that do exist so that you can help to identify the victims. So victim vulnerabilities domestically as well as internationally, as we discussed, women are the majority of the victims. And then children, especially vulnerable youths, are victims as well, and very vulnerable. Richard mentioned the story about the girl running away. So a lot of times it could be that it's, it could be foster care. It could be that the victims have a chaotic home. So maybe they're not in foster care, but have domestic violence, or maybe their parents are addicted to drugs or alcohol, or physical and psychological abuse by the parent or guardian. So that could be that they're in an abusive environment and they want to get away. And then there's some may also be victimized by by a family member or parent. And there's a lot of studies that report a direct correlation between childhood sexual abuse and sex trafficking victimization. And those with a history of sexual abuse are 30% more likely to be charged with prostitution within their lifetime. And I just want to point out one more thing um, about what Richard was saying. I was actually having a discussion just yesterday with someone about, you know, maybe why don't I see these victims? What is this all about? And one thing to keep in mind when you think about all the prostitution. So like we know that large events like Super Bowls and things like that, that there's a larger amount of trafficking happening. So one of the things that you have to think of too is, someone may be thinking they're getting a prostitute, but it may actually be a trafficking victim. So that person may not actually be choosing to do that, if that makes sense. Especially if they're under 18, they don't have the option to choose that. So, okay. So some more barriers to identifying victims. So often victims, why don't you ask yourself, why don't they come forward? So if they're in a hospital, why don't they run away and go tell someone really fast that, hey, this person's trafficking me, help me? And so one of the reasons is victims are often coerced by their trafficker or threatened to remain silent so they don't seek help. It could be, they're being controlled with psychological tactics, intimidation. They could be threatening their family members or their life. And so that's a really big challenge with identifying these victims. And then foreign-born victims have a distrust for law enforcement. And also, in general, foreign and citizens have the fear of, hey, I committed these crimes while I was being trafficked, but I committed crimes. So they're afraid of being held accountable to that and that incarceration because they were forced to do that. And then some victims, as I just mentioned, were mislabeled as prostitutes. So they might even be charged with solicitation. Some of these victims might even be go to jail for a day because of what they're doing, but it could be that they're being trafficked. So there's a big mistrust, in law enforcement with that because they are committing crimes, even though they're being forced to do so. So now Richard will talk a little bit about some victimization red flags to look for and how to spot these signs.
And just to add on, Kelly, to what you talked about, when we look at the foreign-born these individuals that are coming in from abroad, the distrust for law enforcement, and because they may be here committing a crime too, there is a huge concern with the vulnerability of this population that will be coming in through the new administration. And it's the undocumentation that allows them to just disappear within society, and then people who need to help them won't be able to help them because they don't know they exist, and that raises their level of vulnerability to these traffickers, because the traffickers will use that against them and say, hey, you came into the U.S. illegally, you're breaking the law. If you say anything, then I'll call, immigration, or I'll call law enforcement, and they'll come arrest you. You've committed a crime by coming here. So often they're pressured into these situations because, one, they're scared to contact law enforcement that they're being trafficked. And two, that, they know they committed a crime by coming in here illegally, and therefore they just accept the vulnerability. They accept the fact that they're going to be trafficked and fail to identify as a victim. But these are real victims. These are not numbers. These are real people who become victims of trafficking situations, and we've got to be able to recognize it. And when we look at spotting the signs, some of the key indicators, we can talk about providing commercial sex acts, much just like Kelly said, prostitution. There are people out there who are not willingly providing sexual services. They are being forced into providing these sexual services. A couple, this was this last summer actually, a female met a guy online, and this is in one of the investigations we worked in. She traveled down to Birmingham, Alabama from Michigan, and on a Greyhound bus, and she met this individual, and his apartment that she was going to be staying in was actually an extended stay hotel, and they were there, and he knew that she had just gotten out of rehab for use of heroin, and he offered her another hit of heroin, and it got her addicted. And then later that day, he forced her into prostitution. And the next day she says, look, I'm not doing that again. I can't go back to that life. I don't want any more drugs. Please do not give me any more heroin, and I'll never prostitute myself out again. And the individual takes his gun out from his lower back, puts it on the table, and says, yes, yeah, you will. You'll do it every time I ask you to do it. So out of fear, she had no choice. She did it because she knew that he would beat her up, and he did several times. But we were able to rescue her, thank goodness, and she's no longer in that situation. But the fact is she was providing commercial sex acts, but not willingly, not at all. Paid very little or unpaid at all. Like we talked about, some of these individuals that will be coming into the United States that may be illegal and not documented properly. um, they're willing to take $10 an hour, $5 an hour, because they know that they have to have the money to survive. Does that make it trafficking? Yeah, absolutely it does. It's still human trafficking when they're being paid well below that wage. We had a case where an individual was here from Nicaragua, and he was working 7 days a week, and he was getting paid. But at the end of the week, his trafficker would take $25 for using an outlet to charge his phone, $25 for using the washer, $25 for using the dryer. If he wanted to use the refrigerator, it was $40. If he wanted to have his own room, that was $100-something a week. And if he wanted to share a room, it was $50 a week. So basically, at the end of the week, he didn't have any money in his check at all because the trafficker was taking all of that money from him. It was debt bondage. So yeah, so even if you are being paid, it doesn't still not mean you're not being trafficked, right? You work excessive long hours. Remember, it's $150 billion a year business, and they get this person for free or next to free. So they're going to work them as many hours as they possibly can. Unusual restrictions at work, you can't talk to it. Like if you go to a restaurant or a place like that, and they're not making eye contact with you, they're not talking to you, they're not engaging. Remember, it's a clandestine crime. They don't want these individuals to have any outside connections other than that connection at work. So they're not going to feel free to carry on conversations. They're going to avoid any social interaction with you at all, because they're told to, right? They've been recruited through false promises, whether it's a modeling job and now they've groomed them and now they're into prostitution, or they recruited them to come do one job, but now they're doing a totally different job. So when we look at that, rehearsed scripted responses, we all have, we've all been teenagers before, and some of us have teenagers. And I know when my teenager's lying because it's a rehearsed scripted response. And you know that they've thought it out multiple times. When I'm asked this is what I'm going to say. Same thing with a trafficking victim, except they're not thinking it out. The trafficker's saying, when they ask you this is your response. Repeat it back to me. And so when you see that scripted response, automatically know that that's kind of a sign. Attempting to reason away bruises and marks, and Kelly will talk a little bit more about that too when she moves into the clinical session. But we often talk about pimps or traffickers utilizing these individuals as their property. These tattoos that they place on a victim can be unusual, okay, but they're a means of branding their property. They are showing these young girls, these females that they're prostituting out, that you are now my property. This is my brand, and they're putting it on them like cattle. And it shows ownership. And psychologically, for that victim, they identify now as that person's property because of the mere fact that they see this tattoo, they see this branding, and they know that it's there. They're always going to be fearful, depressed, submissive, intense, nervous, and paranoid. Have addiction to drugs. And I asked a girl one time about how long she'd been using drugs, and when I was talking to her, I was like, Claire, so how long have you been? Were you using drugs before you became a trafficking victim, or were they using it as a means of controlling you? And she's like, no, I took it willingly. And I was like, you took it willingly? And she says, I just wanted my day to go by. I just didn't want to be in this situation. I wanted to close my eyes and just wake up and it be a different day. So I used drugs to pass my day so I could get through it. And that's how I became addicted to it. So these individuals have key indicators that we need to look for, whether in a clinician setting or in any setting for that matter. And when we're looking at these, we have to understand that one indicator doesn't make somebody a trafficking victim. Two indicators doesn't make somebody a trafficking victim. But as we look at these and they start layering upon one another, then we have to have a light that goes off that says, And I always tell people it's better to say something and been wrong than to not say something and had been right, when you think about that. So, when we talk about, one of the biggest vulnerabilities in the population right now, obviously, is minors and minor sex trafficking. The news last week ran a whole special on teen sex trafficking. And when we talk about vulnerabilities, we look at that level of maturity that is in that teenage population. And we can look at that as a key vulnerability, just the age in itself, homelessness, presence of an older boyfriend. If you see a teenager that's got an older boyfriend, a much older boyfriend, that is a little bit out of the norm. Signs of violence or psychological trauma, for sure. And traveling with an older man or an older group, chronic runaways, clearly. And law enforcement wasn't originally designed to go after runaways. That's just not their thing. We've pushed a lot off on the law enforcement community. Dogs barking next door, call the cops. Guys got his car parked out in front, call the cops. When we look at this, we've placed a lot on a lot of different industries, and it's hard for police to continually go after runaways every single time because of the resources. And that even elevates the vulnerability of a chronic runaway, because they're out there more and more and more and more, and statistically increases the chances that they could become trafficked. When we look at tattoos, a young teenager getting a tattoo that might be on ordinary for their age, or having STDs, reoccurring all of the time is a key issue when we start looking at some of those aspects. And I think Kelly will get into more when she starts talking about her segment on the clinical setting.
Yeah. Yep. I'm going to talk more about all of that. So, and that's, it's so hard to hear some of the stories sometimes, and to hear, what people are experiencing. And that's, I think, what, drives me to continue training individuals. That's what I hope drives you to listen to this training and pay attention and care about it and share this information, is just thinking about those individuals. And I always put myself as a nurse. I've always said, I'm going to treat this patient like my family member, and I'm going to treat them like I would want someone to treat my mom or my kid. And that's how I'm going to take care of them. I'm not going to cut corners. That's how I'm going to treat them. And I think that about this too. If this were my family member, I would want someone to pay attention. I would want someone to recognize this. So as I go into this, just kind of think about situations you've been in. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute too. 10 years ago, I didn't know about human trafficking. I didn't know it existed. And when I've taken time to reflect back on, when I was working with teens and working in an adolescent clinic and working in patient pediatrics, I started thinking about some situations that were questionable. So here's some tips. Understanding that health problems seen in victims are a lot because of deprivation of food and sleep. So Richard mentioned the woman who, laid on a floor for her whole life. They couldn't even get her a mattress on the floor, and eating food scraps. They're often given the bare minimum, right? The traffickers are trying to keep as much money as possible. So a lot of times deprivation of food and sleep, extreme stress, the work hazards. They possibly will have physical signs of abuse and sexual abuse, and overall just hazardous work. But on this next slide here is what I want to talk to you about, is when you look at them, a lot of victims do not have timely access to health care. So by the time they reach you, they may have very advanced issues and health issues. So I'm not sure if you got it. Okay. So you might see that, they had a UTI and they're progressed to being, it's way more severe, or something that you or I would go to the doctor for. Maybe we get a cut and it doesn't stop bleeding, or some kind of infection. It's well advanced when they come to you. That's a big concern. So you might have things as well, like, if you think of abuse, we can sometimes find, if we do an x-ray, that there were, old fractures that were not documented. Things like that are there too, but it might be things that are just simple things that you would have been treated for quickly are progressed because they aren't seeking healthcare help quickly. High risk of multiple STIs and abortions. So a lot increased from what you would think is typical is something to think about. Cigarette burns, dental problems, always look at the mouth as well and look at the whole patient. They often report anxiety, depression, or post-traumatic stress disorder. They may have sleep disturbances, suicidal thoughts. And so also Richard mentioned that they may be intoxicated or withdrawing from drugs. Okay, so keep in mind that um, sometimes it's easy to overlook a patient that is addicted to drugs. You might think, oh, they're just drug seeking, or oh, they're just, a druggie, and you kind of think of that. So try to think deeper into this when you have a patient, because as Richard mentioned, some of them are doing this just to get by and to survive because the life they're leading is awful and they're not wanting to really, um, you know, be aware. They want to be taken away through drugs or alcohol. But with that, they might be having some issues with, exaggerated startle responses, hypervigilance, avoidance. So maybe they're declining to answer questions or, not engaging in conversation. They might have elevated emotions or disassociation. So they might be really detached from their surroundings and almost appear in a trance-like state. When I think back to a patient I had years ago, she was a teen, and she had multiple STIs. She had abortions. Her mom, I'm going to put that in quotes, was putting her on a depot shot, which is to prevent pregnancy. It's an injection and a birth control option. And I remember she just looked away all the time. She just was kind of sitting there and not very emotional. She would answer me in a very yes, no, control, that way. And I was mostly interacting with the mom. And in hindsight, I think back to her and I wonder if maybe she was being trafficked. Maybe that was a handler that was there with her. It's so important that teenagers are always alone for at least a minute for the healthcare provider to ask a few questions, make sure that they're actually safe, that they're in an okay situation. So who knows, it could have been exactly as it looked, but for a 14-year-old to have as many STIs, to have had abortions, to be, put on birth control, it was concerning with, again, how many STIs she had. And so just kind of recognizing some of that trance-like state, them not wanting to talk to you. Also symptoms of psychological trauma or minimization, denial, memory loss. These things can make it really difficult to get consistent information. And that doesn't mean they're lying. It doesn't mean that they're not telling you the truth or that the story's not true. It could be that they're a little bit confused and running, stories together. It could be just from that psychological trauma causing this. The victim doesn't speak, the trafficker speaks for them. That is a huge concern. And one thing, the victim doesn't speak English, so the trafficker acts as an interpreter. So I want you from this moment forward, if there's one thing you take from this presentation, I was a night shift nurse at one point, and you all know you get an admission at 3:00 in the morning, and the patient comes in, they don't speak English. Well, they have a family member with them that does. Well, wonderful. Now I don't have to call the interpreter line. I don't have to go do that, right? Don't do that. Make sure you have an interpreter there so you know what the patient is saying to you, that you're certain that the information they're trying to convey is true. Okay. And I teach educators now, and I have a student that works in the hospital, and he was explaining to me that they now have a tablet with interpreters, so you could actually it's a face-to-face thing with interpreter lines and different things that you could do. So please seek out that option in your hospital, your organization. Make sure that there's always a true interpreter, a real interpreter, not just a family member. I just want to drive that home because I think about that woman that Richard mentioned. That wasn't her first hospitalization, the woman from the Philippines, but it wasn't identified before. I'm sure the traffickers just spoke on her behalf and said, oh, here's what's wrong. Oh, she's saying this. Oh, she would like this or that. I mean, just think of how easy that is if you don't understand that language, and who knows what they're saying. So just please keep that in mind. A lot of times too, if they're not holding their own documents, This may not be something, if you're a clinician, you may not know, but thinking about, reception in areas where these patients are coming, if they're not holding onto their own documents, if they're an adult and someone else is handing their, license and information, that's concerning. Why don't they have their own documentation? So there's a lot of variables to victimization, as we talked about. They don't all have to be present. A lot of times there's more than one, but through Hope for Justice, there is a red flag checklist that you have access to and can use. And it can just really give you some signs of what's going on, and knowing that these red flags do exist. And it's really this was actually developed for use by healthcare providers. And it has both signs of trafficking for minors and adults. And it's intended to be used for recognizing adult trafficking and determine if further screening is necessary, which we're going to talk about. So I recommend you read through the checklist frequently. Look at it. Be familiar with it. Post it at your organization. Post it at the nurse's station or at the desk. So to think of some of these things and think about how you can use these different tools in your organization. We want you to use them. They're free. Just like our trainings are free, we want to get this word out there. So feel free to take that, change it, make it your own, make it relevant for the front desk, make it relevant for the nurse's station, make it relevant in charts or whatever you have to do, but that people are seeing this. So if you identify a potential victim, so say you get this red flag checklist, you notice some things, you're concerned, you feel like something's just off, you want to provide information about what the assessment entails in the screening and ask if they agree. And if they don't agree, they don't want to answer your questions, thank them for their time and give them some resources, a partnering organizations. Again, one thing to take from this training is make sure you could call Hope for Justice, you could call, there's different things we'll give you at the end. Keep that handy so you know what to do, and you could give that to someone. So maybe they don't want to talk to you right now, or they're too scared. As we mentioned, maybe their family's being threatened. It's not even them that they're concerned with, but their family member. Give them some information so that they have it when they move forward. But let's say that they do agree. Then we're going to go into the screening. Okay, so before the screening, I want you to use a trauma-informed approach. It's really critical in screening individuals who have been trafficked. Clinicians should be comfortable working with trafficking victims, sensitive to their needs, and aware that they're likely suffering from that traumatic experience. The effectiveness of this screening really builds on what we do as clinicians anyway. We want to build rapport. We want to ask questions in an appropriate manner. And some of the things I'm going to give you here are specific to trafficking victims and different things you can do to help with the screening. And before conducting it, make sure you fulfill some basic needs. So if they need some food, if they need some clothing, maybe they need to know where the bathroom is, just some of those immediate needs. Think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We want to give them food, shelter, those basic needs, so then they feel comfortable enough to start talking to you about what they need. Use a competent, trustworthy interpreter, okay, if the first language is not English or your language. And, you want to make sure the interpreters are using the same wording as you. Make sure that that's, again, it should be somebody approved by your organization. And again, with phones, tablets, things like that, there's no reason not to use a competent, approved interpreter. Establish a safe space. You want to make sure the victim's assured of confidentiality. Hold the interview in a non-threatening, comfortable location. Make sure they are never in earshot of the trafficker, okay? Or within sight. They shouldn't be within sight. So, right now with COVID, I think it's real easy to do this because it's easy to say, oh, we have to take this person back for this procedure and no one's allowed to come. Okay, so keep that in mind that you need to get them alone. It could be that they're with the trafficker or somebody working for them. So think about what I just talked to you about with the mom of that teenager I mentioned. I don't know that was the mom. It could have been a handler. Sometimes there's individuals promoted within the trafficking business, and basically maybe it's somebody who is no longer being sold, and so they get promoted to a position to not be sold anymore, and they accept that position because now they just have to go and be with for appointments or different things to pose as the mom or sibling or dad or whoever it is. Maintain a verbally neutral stance towards a trafficker. And I'm sure you guys have heard about, when victims of a crime, they almost might come to the trafficker's defense. There's, that real deep psychological issues. So, you don't want to be a threat to them, and it might be perceived as a threat. You want to just be very verbally neutral about the trafficker themselves. Don't rush the client, allow time. They might need to pause before answering a question. I'm going to go into this a little bit more in a second here during the screening, and then offer to repeat anything if they seem confused. Okay, so let's go into during the screening. So again, make sure you're reviewing the red flags checklist. Make sure you're reviewing the screening questions. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the screening. I have it right here. Have these printed off. Review it once in a while so you're really familiar with all of this. The more comfortable you are, the more aware you'll be of those red flags and also be able to help the victim. So you want to use screening questions that are non-threatening. And so one thing I love about the Hope for Justice screening, again, you're welcome to use this. This is free access to you. It's designed for labor and sex trafficking to identify victims. And it does it in a really great way, these questions, but you could, adjust this as you need to for your organization and what makes sense. But I'm going to read you a couple of these questions because you can understand and hear the questioning type. It's very non-threatening. So here's one of the questions. Sometimes people do unfair, unsafe, or even dangerous work or stay in a dangerous situation because if they don't, someone might hurt them or someone they love. Have you ever experienced this, or are you in a situation where you think this could happen? So that's how these questions are set up to help you ask these in an appropriate way. And one thing is you want to, so if the victim does say that there are some concerns or that they do identify that, yes, I am in this situation, make sure that you express prior knowledge and experience with similar cases. You don't want to seem surprised by this. You don't want to be, you want to convey sympathy and concern, but you don't want to act shocked, like, oh my gosh, I've never heard of that. Because what that's going to do is it's going to make the victim feel like you're not going to be able to take care of them. You're not actually going to be able to help them because you have no idea what you're doing. So even if this is your first time doing this, say, okay, I've known situations like this before. Let's get you some help. I'm going to, you're safe. I'm going to help you get safe. Let's get you to a safe place, whatever those things are. Make sure that you don't imply that the victim was responsible for their own abuse and exploitation. As Richard mentioned, they already feel that. You want to let them know that this is a crime. They are not to blame, even if they ran away from home, a teen that ran away. Convey trusting messages, as I mentioned. We're here to help you. You could trust me. Your safety is our first priority, and you have a right to live without being abused. So to go to the next slide here, there's 3 core elements of trafficking. Do you remember what they are? Force, fraud, coercion. So each question on this screening is meant to reflect one of these core elements to get to the bottom of that, to see if there is force, fraud, coercion. Again, you don't need all 3, you need 1, okay? These were identified as common across a number of screening instruments. And then, as I said, they're constructed to identify both types of victims of labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And it's really used to assess for vulnerable populations, including those who have experienced sexual assault and domestic violence, okay? So this will help you to see if a referral is necessary, okay? They're separate from clinical assessments. They're not looking to identify a treatment plan. That's not the goal. And I want to reassure you with that. Unless you are a trained psychologist, or you're trained to be a human trafficking expert, you don't have to be. All you have to do is screen them and say, yep, I see that there's an issue and I know what to do and who to refer them to. Okay, so this is just showing you the screening here. So that's what I was just reading from, that one of sometimes people do unfair and safe things. But here's another good one. I like this one too. Sometimes lies are used to trick people into accepting a job that doesn't exist, and they get trapped in a job or situation they never wanted. Have you ever experienced this, or are you in a situation where you think this could happen? So again, this screening tool, is available to you to use, to edit, do what you want with. Okay, so during the screening, some trauma and victimization tips to tell you. Remember, you might be the first person that this victim is reporting this trauma to. Okay, so just keep that in mind. These victims have experienced oppression and have had all control taken from them by their trafficker. So offer as much control as you can. And, you know, it's easy as a nurse or a healthcare provider of any kind. Most of us go into this profession because we want to help people. And so a lot of times we could be overbearing with that and we can make all decisions. I'm going to give you some tips at the end too to help with that. But just keep in mind, they've already had all control taken. You want to give them back some of that control. Don't take it all from them trying to be helpful. Okay. So be aware that they may experience long-lasting effects of psychological and physical abuse, traumatic experience, chronic substance abuse. So again, if you're not a mental health expert, you just need to be able to recognize common signs of trauma. And you want to express sorrow, but don't appear judgmental or shocked, as I mentioned. Ask basic questions about the mental health. A few straightforward, non-intrusive questions in a kind manner can convey a caring attitude and help the screener and victim decide if a referral to a mental health professional is necessary. And then again, be reminded they may not want to repeat what's going on. They may not want to repeat it to law enforcement or to others. This could really cause that re-traumatization to happen. So keep that in mind, that they may not want to say it again, or they may actually not want to answer one of your questions. So try to minimize that when possible too, asking them to repeat things. So more during the screening, avoid endangering individuals who've been trafficked. It's critical that professionals resist their overwhelming urge to assist in a manner that will overshadow the will of the client. So different ways that you can promote the client's ability to make their own decisions. Here's a couple ways to do that. You want to allow the client to set the pace of the screening process. You know, we all know in the medical field, especially right now, things are busy, right? But don't appear busy. You want to appear that you have all the time in the world. Allow the client to answer any questions. Allow them to choose what resources they want. One suggestion is, if they do want a referral, you know, call the hotline together, help them call, but let them speak, let them be a part of that process so that they feel that control. And really allowing them to be a part of that decision-making process can help calm their fear and anxiety. And shared decision-making is a key component of a survivor-centered practice. It signals that the needs, wishes, goals, and priorities of the client are important and valued. So because of this profound physical and psychological injuries, a lot of times this could cause issues with other service providers. And just remember, again, this is a reminder that minimization, denial, and memory loss, which are symptoms of psychological trauma, can make it difficult for that consistent information. So if you hear them saying different information to the law enforcement or the person on the referral line, be encouraging, allow them to speak, and know that this does not mean that they're lying. Okay, so after the screening, at the end of a screening for human trafficking, always conclude by going back to the client's concerns. A question or two should be included about whether or not they are interested in those referrals, and if they want a referral to certain agencies, and the choice of what they want. Okay, so just remembering to give them those options. And Rich is going to mention here the different things you could, or organizations you could refer them to. Hope for Justice is one of them. So I will let him take it away there.
Yeah, one of the key things that Kelly talked about was, you know, letting the victim drive the interview process as opposed to us driving it. And we typically see ourselves, you know, driving and trying to draw out as much information as we can, because that's what our jobs entail us to do. But the victim has already been under control, and what they're looking for is not being under that control. So us controlling what they're saying. And another thing to reemphasize is, just because their story changes doesn't mean that they're lying. They've been through so much trauma. It's really difficult for them to keep the totality of the circumstances of what happened, you know, all collective, because a lot of it they're trying to forget. You know, they're pushing it way down, and they don't want to do that. So some of it are the effective responses that we are looking at. Is, you know, the shift in government and how the government looks to address human trafficking issues. Right now, there's over 100 bills right now that are before Congress to change human trafficking laws, to enact them. One of the things is we've got to get away from, you know, charging people with human trafficking and then them pleading out to prostitution. So we go from a felony to a misdemeanor. They get charged $2,000. Their name goes in the paper, and then that's the end of it. That's not really a deterrent. So we have to look at creating reduction in the demand for this. And working with NGOs on governmental agencies, we work with Hope for Justice works with a variety of different institutions, from law enforcement to healthcare centers to hospitals to emergency rooms. We actually work with an emergency room as a responder when they have a trafficking victim that comes in. We are the first responders to that when they're discharging the victim, for us to get that victim into an aftercare program, to get them into someplace safe where they don't have to go back out into the street. They don't have to go back to their trafficker. They have a safe place to go to. And then establishing local task force that include not just NGOs and law enforcement, but community leaders, and also those from the clinical setting, where we're starting to see, an uptick. And, Kelly brought up over, an upwards of 88% trafficking victims have been to a healthcare setting. So it's clear that industry is one of the primary intersections for trafficking victims. They need to be a part of these task force, raising the public awareness, and like what we're doing today. We do this program once a month, but the last 2 months I've trained over 4,000 people. And I think that, that's what we have to look at, is raising the level of awareness. We can no longer bury our heads in the sand and pretend like this isn't happening, because it is happening, and no place is immune to it. Everyone belongs to this fraternity. It's all of us. So increasing the public awareness, providing better resources and counseling and rehabilitation for these victims. It's like if you took it from a correctional setting. When we put people in jail, we put them in jail. If we put their life on pause, then when they get out of jail, they're just going to unpause their life and go right back into doing what they did previously. But providing them a rehabilitative component and giving them a vocation, giving them rehabilitative services, provides them a different opportunity. Same scenario when we're talking about trafficking victims. If we provide them that level of care, we provide them that level of trauma-informed care, counseling, psychological counseling, helping them deal with substance or alcohol abuse that might have pushed them into this situation. And then also, too, looking at it from a vocational setting, providing them with an education and a vocation will put them in a better situation once they're through with the trauma-informed care, to be more successful once they get out, and less likely to have that recidivism back into trafficking, because we know that there's a high rate of that. So, and then obviously improve identification of victims through education and training. When you leave here, I put in the chat box that, you can email us, and I'll put our emails there. We'll provide you with all the resources that you want, the checklist. Feel free to change it up and edit however you want to use for your own individual settings, because it is important that we raise that level of education and training, and expand this to as many people as possible, so that we can certainly make an impact by reaching those people to identify that. So awareness campaigns are important to do. Developing long-term strategies on how we're going to combat this. We're not going to arrest our way out of this. We're not going to go out there and arrest our way out of this. I was at aside from working with Hope for Justice, I'm also a research professor, and I was at a conference that dealt specifically with human trafficking. And another professor from New York, John Jay College, she had taken a survey, and her survey was that on demand for sex, and 8 out of 10 men responded that they would pay for sex if it was legal. 8 out of 10 men said they would pay for sex if sex were legal. 7 out of 10 said that they would pay for sex if they knew they wouldn't get caught. So clearly the demand's there, regardless whether it's illegal or not illegal. Clearly there's only one deviation from the point that, I'm not going to get caught. So reducing the demand, we're not going to be able to arrest our way out of this. So I think it's increasing opportunities for people, so that these vulnerable populations we need to target to reduce their level of vulnerability, their risk to being put into that sector where they are recruited, where they are groomed, and where they are forced into prostitution or forced labor or anything like that. So as Kelly had mentioned earlier, there's a lot of places you can call there are, hundreds of awesome nonprofits that are working in the human trafficking sector. Obviously, if you recognize a victim and it's of immediate concern, 911 is obviously your first option. Contact 911. If you have a victim that comes in your clinician setting and they don't want to cooperate with law enforcement, you can contact Hope for Justice. Our number's there. The email address is there as well. We work a lot with victims who do come into a clinician setting, whether they're actually admitted into the hospital or whether they're just in the emergency room, to get them some safe shelter, to get them into an aftercare program, to get them into a safe situation where their level of vulnerability is of non-existence or as minimal as possible. Or you can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They do a lot of referrals to certain areas and stuff that's in that area. So. And then Kelly, I'll let you close it out here.
Sure. Yeah. And, one thing I always like to mention is I love the founder of Hope for Justice, Ben Cooley. There's a book called Impossible is a Dare that I read when I started training with Hope for Justice. And I loved reading the stories because I heard about human trafficking and it really made me so sad. It upset me. It made me feel like I do want to put my head in the sand. I want to not pay attention to any of this and just, not have anything to do with it, right? Because I want to pretend it doesn't exist, but it does. And one of the things I read in his book was he talks about various stories of rescues they've made, and one was a group of kids, and he was talking about how they wouldn't even look up. They would just sit on the ground. They weren't smiling. It was just so sad because they were thrown food here and there. It was just a terrible situation for a group of children that they rescued. But he was saying a few months later, he came back to, it was one of the lighthouses, Hope for Justice, and basically the kids were running around playing, they were laughing. Victims have gone on to get married, to have kids, to have lives. And it's just, I look at this as, these individuals are just in complete bondage. They have this horrible situation, but at the end of it, yes, it takes the aftercare. It takes maybe some therapy, maybe it takes some other resources or training and different things. And that's what I love about Hope for Justice, is they do all those things. And, but then these people get their lives back, and no, they don't, get those years back, and they don't get all that. But it's amazing to me to see the healing and to see that these individuals can still come out of this and have joy and have a life of their own. And I just feel so strongly that people deserve that. And I know with, clinicians nationally, at least in nursing in particular, human trafficking training is not required across the board. Some states are requiring it. I just believe so strongly that this should be part of our training, looking at those statistics, and it's on my agenda to try to do somehow in some way. But I think you guys being here, just recognizing that you have a particular skill set, you have a job that put you in front of patients or put you in front of people. I mean, anything you're doing, if you're not a clinician and you're here, just think about where you are and your skills, and know that you can make a difference in human trafficking, either by spotting the signs, by helping train, by, giving to Hope for Justice, or whatever it is. Get involved. This is something that is going to take a lot of people to be a part of. And I think about, I live in the Cleveland area, and we just signed up to go to Cedar Point a few days. It's an amusement park by us. And I had read an article about how some trafficking can happen at an amusement park, where maybe a child goes into a bathroom with one individual, the dad is waiting outside and, sends her into the bathroom. And then when she comes out, there's someone else picking her up. So just pay attention to your surroundings, be aware. As Richard said, call 911 if there's something emergent, but, just considering that this exists, it's happening, and knowing that it can, and being mindful of those things and watching where you are. So I just want to encourage all of you to get involved. I appreciate so much that you're all here. It just, I think about the healthcare population, those who get involved in that. Like I said, all of us typically do that because we want to help people. And so I'm glad you're here. I hope you'll share this information when we send the recording. Richard, are you sending the recording to everyone when it's done? Is that what you do? Okay.
I put our email addresses in the chat box.
Okay.
Feel free to email one of us, and we will send you the complete package, which is your screening tools that we had discussed, the red flag checklist, and then a
And the
copy of
video.
it as well.
Okay, yeah, and I hope that you guys will share that with someone. We always say that this training, it's free. We're happy to come, um, train. I know the last one we did, we have one coming up in a few weeks that someone asked us to come to their organization, and so just reach out, let us know what you're interested in doing, and some things are in motion. It might take us a little time here and there, but we want to get it scheduled. We want to train. It's free. It's always free. It's something I love to say because some organizations I know might say, oh, we can't have that. We don't want to pay for that. You don't have to. We're free. Rich and I we'll come talk. So let us come talk and train your people. So we thank you for your time and just hope that you'll reach out to us. And I saw some stuff in the chat happening. So are
Yeah.
you
Is
in
there
there?
anybody have any questions in regards to this that either myself or Kelly can answer?
Oh, dental provider. That's one of the locations. As you saw, most of it's the emergency room, but that is a place that victims are. So that definitely somewhere that needs that training. And also, Janine says that she'd rather be wrong than right. I don't shy away from reporting. Sadly, I've been right most times. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. You're reporting things. That's amazing.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to elevate a lot of people say that they don't want to get involved, or it's not my business, or I don't want to get involved in this, or I could be wrong, but we receive so many emails and telephone calls through our hotline, and regardless of how far-fetched or crazy that the email or voicemail or phone call might seem, we always try to prove the negative, to search to see if it is an actual trafficking case, or if it's not, because that's a victim that hasn't been ignored, or that has been ignored, and we don't want that to happen. So we always try to determine whether it is or isn't a true trafficking case, and work with authorities to get that referred. And like I often tell people that we've taken this fight. A lot of the people that work with us are retired law enforcement that work in our investigative units, because we know that law enforcement can't be everywhere all the time, and it's impossible for them to do everything. So we work investigations to either to pass off to prosecutor's office, or to pass off to law enforcement, or work in concert to supplement them. We're often called upon by law enforcement to help with investigations because they just don't simply have the manpower or the time to do it. So if you see something, say something. I know that's an old cliche, but like I said in the training, that it would be better to say something and be wrong than not have said something and had been right. That victim is a person. They have a name that goes with it. It's not a number. When we look at these statistics, when we think about 5 million people being sexually exploited across the globe, that's 5 million names being forced into sex over and over and over again. That's and it's unfortunate. And if we can save a victim every day, that's one less victim every day.
And one thing too, Rich, that you mentioned, sorry if there's more questions too, we'll take those. But you say that. I know my understanding of human trafficking and all of this before was that I thought people got sold for the day, right? Like I was like, oh, they get sold every night, I don't know, for the day, whatever it is. And their stories, I mean, they're being sold 20 sometimes a day. I mean, you're talking not one person, like they're being sold to for the night. That's not what's happening. It's 20 sometimes a day, sometimes. So I don't think anyone wants that life. But do you guys have any other questions or comments? Oh, somebody said we had a brother doing it to a sister and her 3 friends. You never know. Yep. A lot of times that's what we were saying. It's not like the Taken movie. It's a lot of times a family member or relative, friend of family, or, there's other ways of that happening.
Yeah. A lot of people fall prey to those that they trust, and those who trust that family member manipulates them and grooms them and forces them into this. We're starting to see a lot of we're starting to see the sex trafficking industry move to an online platform, where we're starting to see these young girls who are forced into providing sexual acts online because they had sent a provocative photo, and then they are blackmailed with this provocative photo into providing online sexual services. So they actually get trafficked, and they're not even leaving their bedroom. So this is the money that is made from this is taking this crime to a whole new level, and that's hard to police. When people use websites such as Rub Maps, do they get red flagged by police? Is there any way to track people using these websites? Yeah, Haley. So when we look at stuff like that, a lot of people will sign up on Gmail or whatever with a false email address, and that's what they'll post their information on. And yeah, law enforcement does go out and try to do that, but what we try to do is we work with a with another nonprofit that actually goes out and through the use of technology, and that's all they do is provide is do technology, monitoring. And then what they'll do is they'll look for the commonalities between the massage parlors, and then they'll look for the phone number for the massage parlors being posted online and sexual on sites that offer sexual services, and they try to draw that correlation, and they usually give us that information. In fact, we had opened up an investigation just north of Nashville at a massage parlor that led us to 4 other massage parlors in Louisville and in Atlanta and in Birmingham, and they were all connected. And what they were doing is they were rotating the females each month between city to city, so that there were different 4 girls at the massage parlor. And when we were able to figure all this out and to disrupt this, Kelly said that these people were sold 20 times a day. We'd found that these individuals had serviced over 40 men per day, and I was mind blown by this. And it's difficult to monitor these sites because of the fact that they're ever changing and there's so many of them. And I think that resources are limited as to what we can do. So that's why it does take a partnership between law enforcement and the community, in order, and nonprofits being part of that community to make an impact, to make a change. Watch your kids' Snapchats and passwords. Yeah, obviously we do an online training as well, online exploitation. And when you're looking at this, and I'll just give you a real life example that just happened yesterday. A lady who'd received one of our trainings, not clinical training, but an awareness training, online awareness training, had contacted me, and she says, "Hey, I had your business card and from one of the training sessions you did, and I hope you don't mind me calling you, but I have a question about something." And so, long story short, her next door neighbor's daughter was approached by an individual on Facebook who said that he was a photographer, and he was building his portfolio with to present to a modeling agency, and thought she was gorgeous, and thought she should be a model, and wanted to take photographs of her. And she, of course, was like, yes, I want to do that. Take pictures of me. So he invited her, and the parents were a little bit leery about it, but the mom came and dropped her off, and he took pictures of her in a downtown setting, always in a public place. And then now that's gravitated to, hey, so there's these abandoned railroad tracks. I think it'd be great if we took some pictures there. And she did. And then the picture started escalating into something that was a little bit more provocative. It went from normal clothes now to kind of like bathing suits. And then now he wants her to do lingerie. So as we got online, we started looking at this individual as our investigation goes. And, he's, clearly we've dug in, and he will talk to any girl that reaches out to him. We have undercover accounts where we've talked to him, and his language is pretty perverse. It's pretty it shouldn't be an adult talking to a teenage girl like this. And so it leads us to believe that he has other plans in mind with these young females. And so, yeah, obviously you've got to start watching this, because predators are out there. And I hate to say this, but evil, it looms around every corner. And the more educated we are, the better we educate our children that it's out there. We reduce that vulnerability aspect, because kids at that age aren't in a position, they don't have the coping skills to make the decisions that we do as adults, because we've been there, done that. We know if it sounds too good to be true, probably is. Kids are not like that, and they sometimes make, unfortunately, bad decisions, and those bad decisions can be life-changing.
And they want that love and belonging. That's what they want, and that's what they're seeking. So when they feel there, they want to feel beautiful. And I mean, think of the statistics about broken homes and different things with, that too. There's a lot of direct correlations to seeking that elsewhere. And it's really something that we just have to watch. And that's why I think it's important for all of us to police things and to pay attention. And I think, whatever your beliefs are, different things, but be skeptical. It's okay to ask questions. It's not that you're crazy. And I think that a lot of people took human trafficking in the US to be those four guys looking at me in Walmart, and I thought they were going to try to take my kid. And as Richard said, that does happen sometimes. It's not saying that abductions don't. That's just not the most common, but it doesn't mean human trafficking doesn't exist here. You saw that it does. I hope that if anything, you leave here understanding that it does happen. I know in Ohio, what are we, fourth or something crazy? I would have never thought that. I mean, it blew my mind. So pay attention, because it could be a brother, it could be just pay attention to strange things or a sign. I had my cousin one time call Hope for Justice because she saw a sign saying college kids wanted, great pay, here's a phone number, but no business. Turned out to be like Cutco or something, and it was fine and totally legitimate. But call, ask, it's okay, ask those questions, make sure. We have to keep kids safe, and not even kids, everybody, so. Do you guys have any other questions? I think I saw someone trying to come off mute at one point. Maybe not.
Well, we thank you guys for your time. Thanks for signing up for the training. We will be doing this again next month. So if you know of anybody that would like to, please share our information with them. We're happy to send them the link for next month's training. Thank you guys for being here. And again, email myself or Kelly, and we'll send you that packet of information that you can use and share within your organization. And if you want to take this same training back to your work setting, we're happy to set that up as well. So you guys have a good day and stay safe out there, and we appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great day.